The new beginning. Moving into a new home is often described as the start of a fresh chapter, a time to settle into a community and begin building memories. For the narrator, a hard-working officer finally stepping into the long-awaited dream of homeownership, the excitement was beyond words. Years of service, long shifts, and countless sacrifices had paved the way for this milestone. The house was modest, but it was theirs, and that was enough to ignite a deep sense of pride. The neighborhood appeared quiet, with carefully maintained lawns, uniform fences, and the typical presence of an HOA looming in the background. While the HOA promised to uphold community standards, it also carried the reputation of being overly strict. At the center of this culture was one neighbor, a woman who had already become somewhat infamous among the residents, someone the neighbors had nicknamed Karen. Karen was known for her sharp eyes, endless complaints, and eagerness to impose the HOA rules on everyone else. Whether it was a trash can left out a few minutes too long or a vehicle parked at a slightly imperfect angle, Karen would make it her business. Although the narrator had heard whispers of her reputation, they decided not to let this gossip cloud their excitement. After all, moving into a new home was supposed to be about joy. Not worried that AS boxes were unpacked and the last touches were added to the house, the idea of a housewarming party began to take shape. The narrator had a close group of friends from work who had stood by them during some of the most difficult days. These weren't just colleagues, they were family. And as fate would have it, all of them happened to be police officers as well. It only made sense to celebrate this new chapter by bringing everyone together under one roof. Invitations were sent out, snacks and drinks were prepared, and the atmosphere inside the house was warm and welcoming. Laughter echoed through the rooms, stories were exchanged, and the night felt like the perfect way to honor a new beginning. Outside, however, things were a little different. While most neighbors were curious and happy for the new arrival, Karen had taken notice of the gathering. She observed the cars parked neatly along the street, the faint sound of music, and the occasional cheer from inside. In her mind, this was not a celebration, it was a disturbance. Karen, in her usual fashion, began pacing near her window, peering out as though she were conducting surveillance. She scribbled notes about the number of cars, the time, and even details about who was coming and going. To her, this wasn't just a housewarming. It was a violation of what she believed the neighborhood should be. Meanwhile, the narrator and their friends were completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few doors down. The night continued with ease, the music remained at a reasonable level, and conversations filled the air with nothing but joy. Yet, for Karen, this wasn't enough. She believed order had to be maintained, and she was determined to be the one to enforce it. What she didn't know was that her plan to interfere would backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Because in a matter of hours, Karen would find herself dialing 911, convinced she was bringing order to the chaos, without realizing that the very people she wanted to summon were already there, laughing, relaxing, and enjoying the party inside. As the first chapter of this story closes, the stage is set. A homeowner finally enjoying their dream, a community learning about their newest neighbor, and a self-appointed enforcer preparing to act. What happens when authority meets entitlement? The next chapter will reveal just how far Karen is willing to go to make her point, unaware of the embarrassing lesson waiting around the corner. The watchful eye. While the party carried on inside with laughter and warmth, outside the atmosphere was far less welcoming. Karen, with her blinds barely open, continued her private surveillance of the new neighbor's celebration. Each burst of laughter seemed to irritate her more, and every parked car lining the street felt like an invasion of her carefully controlled community. Karen had always taken it upon herself to be the unofficial watchdog of the neighborhood. Even though the HOA board didn't grant her any real authority, she acted as if the rules belonged solely to her. She would frequently walk the sidewalks, clipboard in hand, recording infractions to submit to the board. Many neighbors had grown tired of her meddling, but few had the energy to push back. She thrived on this lack of resistance, and in her mind, this housewarming party was just the latest opportunity to show her dominance. Her frustration grew as she fixated on the number of vehicles outside. She convinced herself that this was not a simple gathering, it was a disruption, possibly even something illegal. The faint music drifting from the windows sounded louder to her ears than it did to anyone else on the block. She muttered to herself about rules and peace and quiet, twisting the narrative until she believed she was the victim. Inside the home, the narrator's co-workers mingled happily, completely unaware that every move was being catalogued. These weren't just co-workers, they were sworn officers who had shared long shifts, dangerous calls, and unshakable bonds of trust. This wasn't simply a party, it was a celebration of survival, loyalty, and new beginnings. But while the atmosphere inside radiated warmth, outside Karen's thoughts turned colder. She considered her options. Should she confront the new neighbor herself? Should she call the HOA board president? Or should she escalate things further? To her, the answer was clear. In her mind, the party was a violation, and violations demanded consequences. Her decision was sealed when she noticed one of the guests stepping outside to grab something from their car. The sight of another uniformed officer, though off-duty and casually dressed, was completely lost on her. All she saw was another stranger, another vehicle, and another reason to intervene. She grabbed her phone, hesitated for only a moment, and then began dialing the one number she believed would restore order. 911. Karen had no idea what she was about to unleash. She believed she was taking control, holding her ground as the voice of the community. What she didn't realize was that her call would not only backfire but also expose her pettiness in front of the very people she hoped would take her side. As she pressed the phone to her ear and began reporting a disturbance, the narrator and their friends inside continued enjoying the night, blissfully unaware of the storm about to crash into their celebration. The call was placed. The decision was made. And the wheels of an unforgettable confrontation were already in motion. The night was about to take a turn, and Karen was about to discover that her sense of power had met its match in the most unexpected way possible. The call that backfired. Karen's voice was sharp and deliberate as she explained the so-called disturbance to the 911 operator. She exaggerated every detail, insisting that the neighborhood was under siege by a loud and out-of-control party. In her version of events, the music was deafening, the street was blocked by cars, and the peace of the entire community was shattered. She used phrases like rowdy crowd, suspicious activity, and possible public safety risk. The operator, trained to remain calm and objective, took down the information. What Karen failed to realize was that her complaint would be routed to a local department where many of the off-duty officers at the very party she was calling about worked their shifts. To her, this was just another victory in her ongoing mission to enforce rules. To everyone else, it was about to become an ironic twist of fate. Inside the house, the celebration continued without interruption. The officers chatted, laughed, and reminisced about stories from the field. Plates of food were passed around, and the sense of camaraderie filled every corner of the home. The homeowner, thrilled to see their colleagues enjoying themselves, had no idea that one of the neighbors had just put in a call to their own department. Back at Karen's house, she stood by her window with the phone still in hand, waiting for flashing lights to appear. She could already imagine the scene in her head: officers arriving, music shutting off, guests scattering, and the new homeowner embarrassed in front of the entire block. She pictured herself as the hero who saved the neighborhood from chaos. Minutes ticked by, but the outcome she expected never arrived. Instead, something far more embarrassing was brewing. The dispatcher had passed the complaint along, but as soon as the details were cross-checked with the address and context, it became clear to the responding officers that this was no ordinary noise complaint. It was, in fact, one of their own. A fellow officer celebrating a personal milestone. Rather than rushing to the scene with sirens blaring, the responding officers decided to handle it with a lighter touch. They were already aware that several off-duty colleagues were present at the gathering. The situation was, quite frankly, harmless. But they also knew that Karen, the caller, had set herself up for an awkward encounter. As the responding units quietly coordinated, Karen's anticipation grew. She straightened her posture, adjusted her sweater, and prepared to step outside at just the right moment to insert herself into the action. She rehearsed her complaint in her head, ready to deliver a lecture about rules and community standards. What she didn't know was that her carefully crafted moment of triumph was about to collapse. The responding officers weren't coming to shut down the party, they were about to join it. And in doing so, Karen's credibility, her self-appointed role as the enforcer, and her sense of power would be stripped away in front of the very people she wanted on her side. The pieces were in motion. The stage was set. And Karen, standing proudly at her window, was seconds away from a humiliation she would never forget. The arrival. As the minutes stretched on, Karen's anticipation finally paid off. Down the street, the faint glow of headlights appeared, followed by the unmistakable silhouette of a patrol car. She smiled smugly, convinced her persistence had once again restored order to the community. To her, this was victory in motion, a reward for her vigilance. She stepped outside, folding her arms as though she had been personally summoned to provide guidance. Her eyes darted toward the new neighbor's home, where music and laughter still spilled into the quiet night. Karen prepared herself to watch the embarrassment unfold. She imagined officers sternly knocking on the door, warning the homeowner, and dispersing the guests. In her mind, this would prove her right to the entire neighborhood, but what happened next was not at all what she expected. The patrol car rolled to a stop not in front of the party house, but slightly down the street. Two uniformed officers stepped out, but instead of marching toward the door with authority, they exchanged a knowing glance. They recognized the address, the vehicles parked nearby, and even some of the voices carrying into the night. This wasn't a rowdy crowd. They knew it was their colleagues. Karen, however, misread the situation entirely. She hurried over to greet the officers, eager to give her full report. She gestured dramatically toward the house, raising her voice to ensure her words carried. She described the chaos, the noise, and the suspicious people. She even went so far as to claim that the guests seemed to be up to no good, a phrase she often used when she had nothing concrete to say. The officers listened politely, but their expressions betrayed their amusement. They didn't correct her, not yet. Instead, they let her finish her exaggerated tale, nodding along as she dug herself deeper into her own narrative. Then came the moment of truth. Instead of walking toward the house to shut things down, the officers casually strolled up the walkway and rang the doorbell with smiles on their faces. Within seconds, the door swung open, and laughter erupted as they were greeted warmly by their fellow officers inside. The homeowner, their colleague, waved them in with a grin. The atmosphere was light, familiar, and welcoming. From her vantage point outside, Karen's smug smile faltered. Confusion spread across her face as she watched the supposed enforcers step into the very party she had reported. Rather than dispersing the group, they joined it. Rather than silencing the music, they became part of the laughter. The unmasking the laughter spilling from the house grew louder as the two responding officers settled in among their colleagues. For them, this was hardly a call to action, it was a reunion. They exchanged greetings, grabbed refreshments, and quickly blended into the celebration. What was meant to be a formal response had turned into a casual visit, leaving Karen standing on the curb with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. From her perspective, it was impossible to comprehend. She had summoned law enforcement to deal with what she believed was chaos, and instead of shutting it down, they had joined it. Her confidence wavered, but she wasn't ready to surrender. She stormed toward the house, her footsteps sharp against the pavement, determined to insert herself into the situation, but as she reached the front walkway, the door swung open again, this time revealing the homeowner. Standing tall with a calm smile, they greeted Karen as though she were just another neighbor dropping by. Behind them, the sight was undeniable, a living room filled with uniformed officers, some in casual attire, others still in partial gear from their shifts. It was a gathering not of strangers, but of an entire department celebrating together. Karen froze, her practice speech about noise and disruption collapsing in her throat. The reality was too stark to ignore. She hadn't exposed a problem, she had embarrassed herself by calling 911 on a house full of police officers. The irony was so sharp that even the officers inside couldn't suppress their laughter once they realized who had made the call. The news spread quickly through the room. One guest leaned toward another, whispering the details, and soon the entire group was chuckling at the absurdity. Even the two on-duty officers who had initially responded couldn't help but shake their heads in disbelief. The moment was unforgettable, a woman who had built her entire reputation on enforcing rules had overstepped so far that she became the punchline of the night. Karen, red-faced and flustered, tried to salvage the situation by repeating her complaints. She spoke about community standards, about rules being broken, and about disturbances that needed control. But her words fell flat. None of it mattered anymore. The truth was on full display, and the credibility she once wielded like a weapon had evaporated in an instant. Neighbors who had once stayed silent about her behavior began to see her differently. From behind curtains and porches, they watched her unravel in front of the very people she thought would back her. The whispers of disapproval she had once directed at others were now being aimed squarely at her. Inside, the party carried on with even more energy. Officers joked about the irony, raising their glasses to the unexpected twist. What was meant to be a simple housewarming had transformed into a story that would be retold countless times, each retelling sharpening the sting of Karen's humiliation. And as she stood on the lawn, realizing she had no support, no authority, and no credibility left, Karen faced the harsh truth. Her attempt to control the neighborhood had only exposed her own flaws, but this story wasn't over. Because the embarrassment of that night would soon ripple beyond the party. The HOA, the neighbors, and even her own reputation in the community were about to weigh in, and Karen's role as the self-appointed enforcer was about to crumble completely. Dismantled the very influence she had fought so hard to build, the story became more than just a neighborhood anecdote. It was a reminder that entitlement, when pushed too far, eventually collapses under its own weight. And in this case, it collapsed spectacularly, with the entire community watching. For the homeowner and their fellow officers, the memory of that night would always bring laughter. What began as a simple gathering had turned into a legendary moment of poetic justice. And as they continued to settle into their new home, they knew one thing for certain: Karen would think twice before ever targeting them again, because once you've called 911 on a house full of cops, your power is gone forever.